Good evening, Homes of the Church of Christ. Welcome. We're glad you could join us here on September 10th for our PM service as we continue to look through the book of 1 Corinthians together. Tonight we're in chapter 10. We have started a journey in chapter 8 where he talked about eating meat sacrificed to idols. The Corinthians had a question. They wanted to know if it was okay if they could eat meat sacrificed to idols back in chapter 8. Paul answered that question for them by saying, sure, you can eat that meat sacrificed to idols, but it's better to give up your rights and freedoms for the benefit of others. So he answered the question in the sense of there's nothing wrong biblically with eating it, but you want to give that up to help other people who are offended by it and benefit them. Then he went into chapter 9 and used himself as a very good example of doing just that. There was a lot of things he said. He said, I've given up the right to have a wife. I've given up the right to be financially blessed. I've given up all those things for other people. So now into chapter 10, Paul is going to present a bad example of people who didn't give up their rights, who didn't give up their freedoms, who didn't give up what they wanted to do for others. And as a result, they ended up being disqualified. He kind of mentioned last week that he wanted to finish the race. And he's going to get into an example this week into chapter 10 about people who are going to be disqualified because they didn't. So Paul is continuing the same thoughts, the same subject of the issue of meat being sacrificed to idols and giving up rights and freedoms. But now he's going to look at how bad it can get if you do not heed the advice that has been given in chapters 8 and 9. So let's look at verses 1 through 5 of chapter 10 together. Paul writes, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness." So looking at these verses, you may be wondering, how is this applying to meat sacrificed with idols? I mean, what Paul is doing here, he's simply reminding them of Israelite history. And how does that apply to the issue? How does that apply to the question they asked about, can we eat meat sacrificed to idols? You're looking at chapter 10 and you're thinking, this is a different subject, but it's not. It's the same subject. Paul is simply using Israel as an example. He's saying, look at their history. They saw the cloud to follow. These Israelites had incredible spiritual blessings. They got to see that pillar of fire at night. They got to see that cloud during the day. They ate God's food. They didn't have to create their own food. God provided them food in the wilderness. They passed through the parted sea of the walls of the Red Sea. They got to experience and see some amazing things. They drank miraculous water from miraculous water sources that God provided in the desert. There's not a lot of water sources in the desert. The desert is an arid, dry place, and yet they lived for 40 years there because God constantly kept giving them miraculous water sources. And so the whole point here is Paul is saying, look at all that they were blessed with. Look at all they were able to witness. Look at all that they could experience. These people had unbelievable experiences that we don't have. They had incredible spiritual privileges. Yet the Israelites did not please God and ended up being disqualified from being able to enter the promised land. Think about that for a second. Think about the fact that they were able to see and experience so much. Their faith in God had to be huge because of all they were spiritually privileged to experience. And yet, God said, I'm displeased with you and you can't enter the promised land. This little history reminder is a hard-hitting lesson for the Corinthians here. The Corinthians were taking all sorts of spiritual liberties. They were feasting on meat sacrificed to pagan temples. And that's it. The eating of the meat sacrificed, that was just one of the things that they were doing because they could, because they had the liberty to do so. They were expecting, I'm sure the Corinthians were expecting Paul to say, yeah, go ahead and eat that meat, no problem. Because they had already been doing that. They were eating some meat sacrificed to idols. And they thought they were safe in doing so because of all the past spiritual blessings and spiritual experiences they had. They're looking at their life and they're saying, well, look at how much God has done for us. Look how much our congregation has been blessed. Look at how we're taken care of. So therefore, God is blessing us. So therefore, we must be doing the right things. We can go ahead and eat this meat. But Paul is making the point here. Those Israelites still perished. They didn't reach the promised land, even with those blessings and past spiritual experiences. So Paul is making the lesson that's hitting hard to them here. He's saying, you Corinthian Christians are in danger of doing the same thing that the Israelites did back in the wilderness, because you want to fight for your rights and freedom. You want what you want. You have appetites that want to be fed, and you want to save money doing it, so you're doing it and you don't care who thinks about it. You're meeting your selfish wants and needs. You're not thinking about others. Look at verses 6 through 10. Paul writes, now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes, and do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. Paul is making a very clear example here. He's saying, you need to avoid Israel's bad example. Learn from their failure. Look what they did. They failed in their ability to say no to their own desires. They wanted to have immoral sexuality. They wanted to have good relationships with foreigners, and so they got involved with their idol worship. They wanted to complain about their circumstances. And so, I have the right to do that. I have the right to complain about this heat and this sand and this dirt and this food, this manna thing we're constantly eating all the time. It's my right to do these things. And the Corinthians were doing the same thing. The Corinthians were insisting on eating meat because they didn't want to deny their right to do so for the sake of a brother. So therefore, they were doing the same sinful things that Israel was doing. Maybe they weren't having the sexual immorality. Maybe they weren't complaining. But it was still about not having the ability to say no to their own selfish desires. They fell into the same sin of lust. And that lust was satisfying my wants. I want to eat meat and save money doing it. It's the same selfish standpoint that the Israelites had. I'm not happy in this wilderness. I have the right to complain, and so I'm going to. That's the selfish desire that you weren't able to say no to self to. And so Paul is making that clear example here. The Israelites lost their focus. They were focused on their own pleasures and their own wants instead of God. And Paul is reminding them, you need to learn from them. Keep your focus on Christ, not on your own rights. Give up your rights and freedoms to protect others, as that is the most loving thing to do for Jesus. It may not be the most loving thing to do for self. It may be harder when you go to the store and you spend more money, but you're doing it because of the love for Christ and the love for other people. That's not selfish. Look at chapter 10, verses 11 through 13. Paul writes, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overcome you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So now is Paul giving a reminder that the Corinthian Christians need to stand strong against temptation. He makes the point that the failure of the Israelites were written down. They were written down for the purpose of us learning from them. That's why God instructed them to write down their history, so that we in the year 2023 in Lansing, Michigan can go back and say, man, look where they messed up. Look what they did wrong. We don't need to do that. We need to avoid that. Paul is making the point that's why God had him write it down. It's for our benefit. They failed because they gave into temptation to please self. Paul is saying you stand strong against that same temptation. The issue of eating meat and saving money is about pleasing my own wants. Don't fall into that temptation. Be willing to give up what you want for the sake of others. Be unselfish. But he does acknowledge that eating the meat is tempting. I mean, think about that. Rationalize yourself through it. Eating meat is good protein. It's good for the body. It tastes good. And it's saving money if you buy it as one that's been sacrificed from the idols. It's a lot cheaper. Biblically, we have the right to do so. We have the freedom to do so. When you look at all these reasons, when you look at those 4 reasons, you think, man, that's pretty tempting. Paul is acknowledging that is a tempting list. And it's easy to get tempted by Satan here and to start rationalizing selfish behavior and selfish decisions. You can start thinking, so what if a brother gets mad in his weakness and lack of knowledge? Who cares? If he gets mad, so what? I have the right to do so because of those 4 reasons. And that's what Paul is saying. There lies in the temptation, is how we justify our selfishness. Paul is saying we should care. We should care about others. We should let our love and care for others overcome that temptation. Paul is reminding us that the I can because I'm right attitude, that is a common temptation to man. Every one of us face that same temptation. You may be looking at this passage and thinking, well, this whole thing about meat being sacrificed to idols, that doesn't even apply to us anymore. Maybe the specific issue does not apply, but the common temptation is selfishness and lack of willingness to sacrifice self for others. That's the base issue. And that's what Paul is saying. That's a common temptation that we all face on a daily basis. It is hard not to be selfish and to think of others constantly. And so in that sense, the eating of meat was not a unique or special question. It wasn't something that just applied to them 2,000 years ago, and it applies to us because the underlying issue is so important. It's about the heart. And the heart of the matter boils down to the common question of, am I going to be selfish and do what I want, or am I going to give up my rights and freedoms for others? Sadly, the Israelites chose selfish. And as a result, they were disqualified from entering the promised land. They weren't able to enter. So we're left with the same question, isn't it? The same question applies to us today. What will you choose? Are you going to choose to please self and symbolically eat of the meat, even knowing other people don't appreciate that? And are you going to please self and offend a brother or sister based on those actions? Or will you choose to give up the right for others? The same punishment will be dealt to us. If we choose selfishness, we're going to be disqualified from the promised land. We're not going to be able to enter into the land of rest, into the land that flows with milk and honey, into the land where God has prepared for us. But if you choose unselfishness, if you choose love for fellow brother and sister, and give up your rights, God is going to say, welcome to the promised land. Enter, my good and faithful servant. Is that going to be your fate? Is that going to be your choice? Will you live a life of unselfishness or a life of selfishness? That's really what this boils down to. Israel's bad example is a lesson to us all. Let us learn from it. That is the lesson, and hopefully it has been beneficial to you. Let us go to God in prayer and to close out. Father in heaven, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for the study in chapter 10. We thank you for Paul giving us that reminder that in history, Israel failed and were not able to enter the promised land. And let that be a lesson to us. Let us take that lesson to heart. Apply it in our lives. Help us to choose unselfishness. Help us to choose love of others above ourselves. Help us to choose to give up our rights for the sake and love of others. And help us to live this so that we can enter the promised land with you someday. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Good night, Holmes Road, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.